Welcome to Community Capital, a podcast about visionary founders and dedicated community builders who are shaping the future one connection at a time. I'm your host, Zehra and Erica, Head of Founder Community at Republic. Hi, Erica. Thank you so much for coming on our podcast. We're so excited to have you. I would love to open up the conversation and first say that you're incredibly accomplished. You've done so much in a very short amount of time, and you're someone who I think has become a pillar and a voice in the VC community. And all this to say, we're super excited to have you. I would love to kind of understand, you've done so much. You've been a founder, you've been a VC, you're now founding your own fund. Did you always know what you wanted to do early on in your life?
In my mind, I feel like I'm just getting started, and in terms of did I always know I wanted to do this? Definitely not. I was actually reflecting on this the other day. One of my good friends lives in DC, and he actually works in the White House, and we were talking about how when I was younger, I wanted to be president. And I think I was like, I'm going to be the first woman president. I memorized all the presidents. I remember I went to the White House and I got a tour of the East Wing when I was maybe 7 or something. And I think I always knew I wanted to be the boss. I always knew that I wanted to be the leader, whether that was saying I wanted to be president, whether that was group projects, whether that was starting an organization in middle school or high school or college. That was always my vibe. I think I didn't know exactly what industry I would apply those leadership skills to. Everyone in my family is in medicine. Mom, dad, aunts, uncles, my sister, brother-in-law, they're going to become doctors. They're now in medical school. So for me, I think I always thought not medicine, but I don't know what else, because I didn't know any better. And then when I got to college, I found out what entrepreneurship was and realized, oh my God, I'd been an entrepreneur throughout my life. I had different businesses as a kid. I've always been very nosy, going up to people, asking questions. And so I think once I had the language to articulate my strengths, then I was like, oh, this is the area that I know I can excel. But I didn't know. You don't know. If you don't see it, you don't know it.
Yeah, for sure. And then I always also love to ask people, if you did have a moment that you knew you were gonna start your fund. I feel like with you, it's you had a company, you've done so many stuff, so I feel like there's so many moments in your life that I could ask about. But I am just really curious what that moment was like for you, because you were in VC, and then of course got to you made a huge impact in the few months that you had first broken into the ecosystem. I remember seeing you on Twitter, and then you just climbed up the ranks, and it was amazing. And so I'd love to understand what it was like for you when you were thinking about starting your fund, and what that moment was that you realized you were going to do it.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think I still ask myself that a lot, what's that one moment? Because it feels like so many little moments. I think for me, ultimately, I am a founder at heart. Before I even joined venture, I'd started 3 companies. I've been second employee for another company for several years. So I've always thought of myself as a founding member, founding teammate. And so I think, working at my previous fund was such a great learning ground for me to see what it meant to work in an emerging fund, what it meant to be small and hustling almost as a startup VC, if you will. But I think ultimately, being there, I realized I wanted to invest with a different point of view. I wanted to invest with a different strategy, and I wanted to do things the way that I saw there was opportunity. And I think that happens a lot, at whether it's big companies or VCs. Usually I think the reason people leave is they see a different way that maybe isn't being adopted at their current place. And so while it can be so valuable for that initial training, ultimately I realized the best way I'm going to learn and the best way to make impact is if I have the free will to do this myself. And I also, it's so funny, I haven't thought about this in a while, but I had a conversation with one of my friends who we both know. She and I were getting coffee in LA, and I remember she had said, so when are you starting your own fund? And she is still someone that I really respect. And I said, what are you talking about? Not for a long time, I've got a lot to learn. And she was like, I don't know, just think about it. And I think actually that conversation planted the seed, because when she first said it, I was like, what are you even, you're on something, there's no way. But I think her belief in me just planted that seed, and then ultimately I decided, obviously after months of iteration and thinking that this was the right move for me.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think I know who you're talking about because she also asked me something very similar.
Really?
And that was a huge moment for me as well.
Yeah.
But when it comes to also starting a fund, I think we are in this interesting point in the VC ecosystem where I feel like there's a lot of conversations about starting a fund. We had so many emerging managers during like the pandemic come through.
Yeah.
And I think it's very much become something people are realizing is actually a choice that exists and is something that people can pursue. But at the same time, I also feel like there's just, like if I were to go through the process, I have no idea where one would even start. And so when you decided to go forward with it, when you had that moment, what were some of the things that you knew you immediately like had to establish? Was it like thinking about the brand, or was it just starting to talk to founders, or was it like the LP conversations? Like how do you even begin to even start a fund?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think the first question for me was like, am I going to do this solo or with someone?
Mm-hmm.
And I think because once I kind of got up the confidence to be like, okay, I want to start a fund. No, I don't know the timing of it. Like, I need to figure out when it makes sense. Obviously, right now the timing is really hard to build a company, build a fund, but in some ways it's also the best time because if you can do it now, you can do it anytime. So I think the first thing for me was figuring out whether I wanted to do this with a partner or not. And there's someone really amazing who I will not name out of respect for his privacy, who I was ideating with for a bit. Really, really brilliant guy. Good friend. We've worked together. Ultimately, we decided that we were better off, me doing this solo and him supporting however he could. I think the 10-year venture commitment is really intimidating, and I think, that wasn't something he was ready to fully commit to, which I think when starting a fund, people need to realize that it's a 10-year commitment minimum. So that was the first thing, was like partner or not. Another thing was really getting clear on the thesis and sort of like why exist. I think to your point, there are so many emerging managers, some of which will, last, some of which won't. But there's so many. It's like when you've got a crowded space in a market as a founder, right? Like, why you? What's different about you? Why would someone give you money and not you, right? Like, you're really accomplishing your, why is someone give me money and not you money? Like, there's so many other brilliant emerging manager friends we both have. Why would they give me money, not them? So I think then it was really spending time on really clarifying the thesis and gut checking it with people. Then what else? Then what came next was, there's like two more things. One was brand, like you said. I felt very strongly I wanted to have a really great brand that symbolized something bigger than myself. The fund is called Park Rangers Capital, and there's a whole analogy around park rangers that, for me, signifies what I want to see change in venture. So spent a lot of time working on that. And then the last piece is, I had a fourth thing I was going to say. Speaking with, I actually had over 200 calls with emerging managers, 200 different emerging managers. It was exhausting, but it was worth it. To learn about their fund thesis, to learn about their fundraising strategy, to learn about how they saw themselves in the market, so that I basically had a good competitor landscape in my head before I even went out there, so I could make sure that I was differentiated. I could make sure that I was speaking the right lingo. Like, a lot of this stuff's intimidating. Like, when we're talking about portfolio construction, we're talking about back office and data rooms and look. It's like, shit, I can't hop on with an LP and be like, I don't know. So it almost helped me with all those reps. I could almost ask the dumb questions to those folks. And so, I would say those were kind of those like early few months, of all the steps.
And so pivoting now into the fact that you've invested in incredible companies, you've definitely seen a lot of different pitches across the board.
Yeah.
I kind of want to break this down into two questions because I think you would definitely be able to provide insight on both. When it comes to like your top tips for founders that are starting to fundraise, let's say like at the seed level, what are those like top tips you would give for them? And then on the investor side, like, I think what I really admire about you is you're really good at asking precise questions, so you don't really waste time. And I feel like that's a skill that you really have to practice. And so when it comes to investors who are now thinking about like, what questions do I ask these founders, what tips do you have, I guess, on that side of the fundraising from the VC perspective as well?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think in terms of tips for founders, I mean, some of these are easier said than done. I just want to be very clear. Like, a lot of it, what I'm saying is talk. The action is so hard. I mean, I think the biggest tips for me are like, as much as you can, building relationships before you start a fundraising cycle is everything. Building relationships with other VCs, building relationships with other founders, going to events when you're not needing to fundraise, because people then, I feel like they think their intentions are a lot clearer, and they don't feel like they need to always get something out of it right away, and people are a lot more willing to help. So I'd say that's like my biggest tip. In terms of like the actual pitching process, I mean, I think like running a really smooth process is very important. I think like once you have a meeting with someone, you should be following up within 24 hours. You should be then following up again within a week. You should be like sending interesting articles. You should be keeping them posted on the fundraise. I think it sounds so crazy, and I feel this way as someone who's, you know, on the VC side, raising from LPs, like, and it's so much easier said than done, but like running a smooth, organized process will make you stand out. Just that alone. Take idea out of it, take market out of it, take team out of it. So I'd say those are probably the most important things, is like raising or building network when you're not raising, running a smooth process, and then obviously it's so unique to the individual, like the advice on the pitch. I think what's really important too is like doing your homework obviously on the VCs or the angels, knowing what their thesis is, and I would say those are big things. In terms of questions for founders to ask investors, I'm so glad you asked that. I think not enough founders do that, and I'm seeing firsthand, I won't go into specifics, but how that can go really sideways. Having the wrong investors on your cap table, especially in times like now, you can really rack up the legal fees if there are issues. You can really feel lonely and stranded if they're not going to help you raise your follow-on capital or put in follow-on capital. So it's everything. In terms of questions, I would say some questions you can ask the investor for sure. What do you find exciting about this space? Who are, you know, the competitors that you've already spoken to? Trying to kind of get to the nitty gritty. What's your background? What's your thesis? But I actually think more than anything, you should be back channeling with people that are not the investor and not the fund. And that's one thing that actually I've learned the hard way, the importance of doing that. Speaking to the founders that investor has also backed. Not the ones that they tell you, speak to these founders. Who have they actually backed that they're not telling you to go speak to and talk to them and say, what's the best stuff and the worst stuff? You know, the roses and the thorns. And so I think that for me is really important. You know, speaking to previous employers, like speaking to folks in the ecosystem. Often I think when it comes to back channeling, going right to the source, you don't always get the truth. And so I think this community is very small, and speaking to folks just in their orbit, but not them specifically, is important.
For sure.
Yeah.
I love that you said that, because I always remind founders that when they're putting an investor on their cap table, they are just like, it's ownership. Like, these people are owning something that you've built, something that you're going to continue to build, and I feel like a lot of people forget the long term that can look like, especially on the pre-seed and seed level. So I love those tips. And naturally, we're on a podcast called Community Capital, and community, I think, is so rooted in what you've built, first from the community that you established when you got into the VC world, and then now with your fund, and then the elephant thesis and everything that you kind of have now, I guess, like redefined so succinctly what the future of VC looks like. I love your thesis, and so I would love to just give the opportunity for you to explain it, and then I'd also love to understand, like, how did you come about to like choosing the elephant? Like, what was the motivation there? I just want our listeners to hear everything about it, because I think it truly just signifies we are kind of out of the unicorn era. Clearly, like with companies like Republic, like we care so much about community customers as part of your cap table potentially, and really just being like that momentum behind a company. And so yes, would love for you to just like give a whole spiel on your thesis.
I love it, and I think Republic, to your point, does it really well. And it's so fun to find, like, you know, hidden elephants in our midst. So first of all, thank you for that. I think, so for those who don't know about the elephants thesis, basically that is I wrote a foundational essay called Elephants Not Unicorns for my fund. And the idea was, yes, to share my perspective with others, but also like logistically, I wanted a pre-read for potential LPs, because I was finding I was having a lot of conversations where they weren't qualified leads, and it was more than anything like, this is my point of view, like if it resonates, let's talk. If it doesn't resonate, all good, don't waste my time. So that's the truth as well. It was like, I think it had like a very much like a utility purpose in the beginning, and then it ended up doing well on social media. So the purpose of it was, the thesis itself is that there's like two key trends that are leading to us needing to back elephants, not unicorns, and I'll start with those. So the two trends are, democratizing company creation. So this idea that we've spent the past couple decades, especially in venture, backing software companies that have made it really easy to start other software companies. One of the best examples that I think everyone knows of that can head nod is like We had low-code tools for a while, now we have no-code tools. Anyone can build a website. Anyone can honestly code right now, which is pretty crazy, and build software. And then we've got obviously this AI revolution, which again, in every way, it's making things better, faster, easier. Even like content marketing, like you don't need a whole department, you know. So I think we're going to continue to see these foundational blocks. Obviously, crypto in many ways has also helped speed up. So we're in this place now where like my mom can start a software company. So then the question there inevitably becomes, if anyone can start a software company, which is a question I ask, okay, then how am I going to pick the winners and the losers? The second key trend to that was the loneliness epidemic, which I'm very passionate about. I've suffered tremendously from loneliness, especially during COVID. And you know, the numbers are staggering, how Gen Z especially is feeling lonely, struggling with their mental health. And I think it's like even bigger than that. We're not religious at all as a society, and it's even more so with younger generations. We don't trust corporations, media, government. Obviously, remote work is making us very isolated. Social media is making us very isolated. And so there's like all these trends that get even worse for the other generations that are pointing to like the companies that can tap in for our need to connect are going to win, because it's only going to get worse. The U.S. Surgeon General just did a whole podcast tour talking about this epidemic. And so for me, kind of those two trends point to like, you know, it's really easy to create a software company. What's the moat? In my opinion, it's community, it's organic growth. And then the second piece being we're really lonely. So those were the two trends. And then I was like, okay, I invest in companies that tackle this. How can I come up with a new icon that can symbolize this new wave? I think unicorns for me never really worked. Total respect for Eileen Lee who coined it. She's brilliant, but I don't really believe that a subjective valuation metric of $1 billion, which in many ways is propped up by other VCs, should be the milestone that we say is like success. We invested in, you know, several companies at my previous fund where, you know, they're like, you get close to it, you hit it, and maybe it doesn't stay that way. One very famous one was what happened with Hopin, right? At its peak, it was valued at $7-8 billion, sold for its parts for $15 million with an M. Like, so I think for me, I'm like, what's a more holistic way to think about supporting companies and valuing companies? And so that's where the elephants came in. You know, unicorns don't exist. Elephants live a very long time. They're very collaborative. They're very smart. They're very powerful. And so that is kind of what I want the next companies to represent. And then I have 3 key traits, which I'll quickly just share, are community-driven companies, purpose-led companies, and founders building in public, that I found were kind of the through lines amongst the elephant companies I want to back. So that's the thesis. It was obviously a bold statement. Because it's kind of saying the way we think about companies is wrong. But I think more than anything, actually, I think about it as like getting back to old venture. Yeah. Old venture, pre-bull market was, we are backing generational companies. These are 10-year funds, like, you know, the Apples, the Facebooks, whatever, that are still going to be around, that go public and last. And like, sounds so crazy, I want to back those, you know, and I think the way to do that is by praising a different set of characteristics. So that's a thesis. I am in the works of writing more content and essays around it. Because of the response, there were so many just like questions and ideas, and I've been very inspired to keep building on it and share that publicly, so more to come. And then the last thing you asked me was how I came up with it. And I think it's something I ideated on for a long time. I also had an amazing, brilliant, wonderful collaborator who, he is just such a brilliant writer and thought partner for me and a friend. And so I have to give him a lot of credit too for, you know, he'll be kicking himself and mad that I'm giving him any credit because he's so humble. But I really feel like I would not have come up with this without him just bouncing ideas with me and helping bring this to life. So
yeah, I mean, I love the way that you're kind of like explaining that the metric of like $1 billion valuation shouldn't be how we define success. Like, I think obviously Glossier is a very interesting example because they did get to that $1 billion valuation and then stuff kind of went crazy from there. But I also feel like VC is a model that, like you said, needs to go back to thinking about like the longer term versus thinking about just getting to a certain valuation, whether it's what happened with WeWork, Glossier, or if it's like CPG CPG companies that now like get burned by VC because those companies ended up really not going in the direction that they wanted to. So I just find it fascinating because I do think you're starting to bring back the conversation of like which companies make sense for VC and then which companies don't necessarily need VC, but they need to go down these other fundraising options, which fundraising has no like pedestal. There's not like a certain pedestal that means something for one type of fundraising over going another direction that may make more sense for your business model. And that's why I love what you're doing with this conversation, because I think you're bringing that conversation back into the mix. Like, you don't always have to go down the VC route. There's debt, there's stuff like Republic, there's regular crowdfunding, there's a lot of different ways that you can take it. And I think that pedestal and hierarchy of what type of fundraising is best is kind of what I think you're starting to break down in these conversations. And so I love all of it. And I guess now pivoting to a different perspective in community, when it comes to building community, it's such a like, I think people just sort of don't always know what that means. Like, frankly, I've built a community and I have no idea how I started it either. And so I think I would love to hear if in hindsight you do have like a few things that you noticed that you did or a few things you noticed other people do that kind of come up as commonalities in building a successful community, whether it's around yourself or around your brand or around your fund. Like, how do you even start to do that?
Yeah, that's such a good point. I do want to touch on one thing you said about elephant companies. And how it's, you don't always need to raise venture funding. I think that's so spot on, and that's something that I'm trying to get across. I, from a venture fund standpoint, am going to be backing 100x potential elephant companies, but elephant companies can exist that are bootstrapped, that actually don't raise venture funding at all. And so I think, to your point, I completely agree. I want to change how we think about company building fundamentally. Fundraising, how you build your company and fund your company, that's conversation too. But if you're trying to build an enduring company, I think you need to go this elephant path. So I completely agree with you, but everything I am backing is venture backable and venture scalable, but you don't always need to be. In terms of your community question, it's a great one. You know, I actually have this strong belief that, you know how entrepreneurs say like it's a blessing and a curse? Like, I was born an entrepreneur, I couldn't work for someone else, but I love building companies, but it's so hard and I couldn't have it any other way. The way that we just accept that being born an entrepreneur and being entrepreneurial is a thing, I actually think the same thing about community building. It's in your blood. Now, of course, you can become a better entrepreneur and you can become a better community builder, but I think it's just innate to some people and it's not innate to others. You're the perfect example of someone where, again, you just said, I don't know how or why, but I just build community. I just am a community builder. That's just, it's like an entrepreneur when you ask them, you know, why are you building? What I don't know. I was 10 and I needed to make money, and so I just did, and I can't explain it. So I think there's actually a lot more parallels there than people give it credit for. In terms of things that like make a good community builder or things that I've seen, I actually think because often you are the face of something, you are the glue of something, you actually need to have a really strong sense of confidence and a strong sense of self, and that typically translates to a pretty strong personal brand. I think there's a reason why like God is at the center of religion. I won't get into all that, but like we typically do like a figure at the heart of these like, cult-like communities, if you will. And so I think that there often needs to be that, some of those traits in an individual. And I think often community builders don't know they're community builders until someone else tells them. It's just like I didn't know I was an entrepreneur until a teacher pulled me aside and told me. But when you see one, you know them. And so yeah, I don't know that I have the best answer there, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, for sure. And then my last question now, a lot of people have had to take like a second to think about this, but I'm gonna actually ask you for 2 words because I'd love for one word that you think defines being a founder and then one word that you feel defines being an investor.
Ooh. One word that defines being a founder is resilience. It's the hardest thing in the world. Finding product market fit. I was with a founder yesterday, former founder, now turned VC, who, we were talking about how you can have the most incredible team. Some people on the team are famous. The most amazing investors. Some of the investors are famous. Really interesting market. It's very hot, it's growing, and still not find product market fit. And you can have all the pieces, and you can still not do it. And that happened to him, that happened to me. We vented about it. So I think it just requires an insane amount of resilience, because it is so hard and you can do everything right and still it doesn't work. And you only know that if you've done it. one word to describing an investor, I would say philosophical. I don't think enough people talk about this. It's funny because my mom is now a doctor, but she majored in philosophy.
Oh, wow.
Which is so random. She was a philosophy major, pre-med track, and so I think because I was raised with her, I always ask like pretty deep questions. I love Oprah. Like I love thinking about like the world and where it's going, and I actually think that that's totally essential to be a good investor. Whether you have your own fund or you work for someone, it is a future predicting job. That's the job. The job is like over the next 10 years, I think this company could be a gigantic success. In my book, I think this company could be a gigantic elephant company. You know, you got to really think about what you want to be investing in, where you see the world going, what you want your role in that to be. How do you put it all together into something that people can understand, right? That's a lot of philosophy too. It's like taking these very complex ideas, simplifying it into writing for people to understand. So I actually think it's a very philosophical job, and for people who love to think and read and future predict, I think it can be a very fulfilling job. Now you obviously have to be able to, especially if you're doing more growth stage, be a lot more analytical. You have to be a good people person if you're earlier stage especially, but I think the big thing that people don't talk about enough is how philosophical it is.
Yeah. I love both of those words. We haven't had those answers yet, so I feel like it adds to the diversity of everything that we've asked our guests so far. But thank you so much for coming on. This was super insightful as I anticipated, and just thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom.